Okay, let's make a quick plan. I will put some stuff up today to help you out on this, but what do you say a week from today we have our first map quiz, okay? And that will be a map quiz on South America. So, it's not like there's a whole lot to that. There's a million maps of South America out there, but all that happens is I give you a map with numbers on it and you tell me what state you're looking at. Okay, it's that simple, nothing to it. So learn the nations of South America, and it's straight out of 4th grade geography, but I will put up some study maps and I will put up a list of the actual nations you need to be able to identify, and hopefully I'll have that by the end of the day. But let's do that on a week from today. So we won't have it Thursday, but we'll have it a week from today. Everyone's got that? Okay. And next Tuesday is September 6th. Okay, so now that we have that down, let's keep going. We had discussed France. Whoa. We had discussed France and how Henry IV had become king, and he was actually a Protestant. He was a Huguenot, unheard of, but I guess there's a first time for everything, and that caused a tremendous rift across the nation because, of course, we have to be loyal to the king no matter what. That is a tradition that goes back about 1,000 years. At the same time, we have to be loyal to the church no matter what. That is a tradition that goes back about 1,000 years. And suddenly, when being loyal to the king means you're not loyal to the church or vice versa, we could be looking at civil war, as France is now deeply divided. The Protestants in France, although again small in number, certainly thought that this was an opportunity to finally break France away from the grip of the church. And rest assured, politically, the Pope has his fingers in everything all across Europe. Yet Henry IV was not willing to have a civil war over the issue, and so he just converted to Catholicism, wink, wink. That made the Pope and the church happy enough. It angered the Protestants, of course, so he threw them a bone a few years later with the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes was designed to resolve this question once and for all. And under that, Protestants are free to worship without persecution, provided that they keep it on the down low and not try to change the French character away from Catholicism. And of course, nobility must be Catholic, although a few certainly broke that rule moving forward. The king and the royal family, that is a non-starter. The king and the royal family must be Catholic without doubt. And if you are in any way in line to be the king, if you could possibly find yourself king because of your family tree, if you're the sons or brothers or whatever of the king, cousins, you must be Catholic. There is no room for Protestantism there. So it didn't necessarily make everyone happy. Compromises rarely do, but it did end the turmoil within France. Well, as I mentioned, oh, by the way, if you want to know another picture of Henry IV, here he is. Okay, the French Revolution was a bit of a wild time, and that is going to be when France finally does kick the church out in terms of its political activity. And the royal graves were robbed, and lots of disruption took place. And a few years back, somebody found a head in a box in a French attic, and they thought it might be Henry IV, and sure enough it was. And so here's the head of Henry IV. When you're 500 years old, you're not going to look any better, I promise you that. Let's talk about Spain. Let's talk about Spain. I mentioned we are going to bounce around on the timeline. We're going to bounce around on the timeline. So let's dial back the timeline to the beginnings of the Age of Exploration, which will be the catalyst for Spain becoming immensely wealthy and powerful. During the 16th century, the 1500s, Spain was definitely the wealthiest, most powerful nation in Europe, if not the world, because Spain was able to conquer and colonize the Western Hemisphere, or certainly much of the Western Hemisphere. All that Peruvian gold made Spain crazy rich. You get the idea. Now, that doesn't mean that Spain developed its economy. That doesn't mean that Spain educated its people, built roads and bridges, and infrastructure, prepared itself for the day the gold wouldn't be flowing in. Spain remained a peasant nation. 98% of the country are illiterate. And so we will know that by the 1600s, Spain will decline very rapidly. But for about 100 years, we are dealing with a very, very influential, powerful nation. Now, when it comes to religion, for hundreds of years, Christian armies in Spain had driven out rule by North African Muslims. This is an event called the Reconquista, or the Reconquest. Spain was really an Islamic region, very much an extension of North Africa. And the church, of course, does not like this. It does not like the idea of Muslims and Muslim leadership in Europe. And we're certainly not getting into the lengthy history of the Reconquista, but you have to understand this was very, very brutal. And Christian leaders connected to Christian Spanish nobility engaged in really, really nasty stuff to make sure that Muslims either converted or left. And they did the same thing to Jews as well, by the way. And you've heard perhaps of the infamous Spanish Inquisition, right? You know, the heresy trials where people would be brought in and brutally tortured into confessing their sin, and rest assured, one way or another, they're going to get a confession out of you. That was one of the tools that they used to drive Islam out. You know, the armies would go into a village or a populated area, round up a few people, do absolutely horrible things to them because they were not Christians, and then turn to the rest of the population and say, okay, who here is going to be Catholic? And everybody raises their hand. And then, of course, once it is locked down very solid in that region, they move on to the next. And this was a multi-generational campaign. The simple answer is, by roughly 1500, Spain is solidly Catholic. The last of the Muslims were driven out in 1492, the same year as Columbus. Spain becomes the nation we know today, and you better believe you're not even going to whisper the idea of Protestantism in Spain. There are no links that the church or the Spanish leadership will go to ensure that you are a loyal Catholic. And so Spain is a devoutly Catholic nation. And the same, by the way, is true with Portugal, but we're keeping this simple. Now, the Spanish crown is a member of the Habsburg family, and we'll get back to them in a minute. The Spanish crown is a member of the Habsburg family, and the Habsburgs are devout Catholics, of course. They are not like the French nobility, which will go back and forth. We've mentioned this already. Now, as we mentioned with France, we have to understand how being king works. When the king dies, the eldest son becomes the next king, right? And if there isn't an eldest son, then the next brother becomes king, so on and so forth. You all get the idea. The key here is there is a clear line of succession that is fixed. You do not get to question it. You do not get to decide who the next king is. And the same, of course, is true with Spain and other Western European nations, just like in France. Now, what happens when royal families marry each other from within other nations as a means of creating political partnerships and alliances and so on and so forth? What you have to understand is that if you are a member of the nobility, particularly if you are the child of a king, you're not going to pick the person you marry. You're not going to decide what that part of your life will look like. Your marriage, either male or female, will be decided for political purposes. We want to form an alliance with this country, so I'm going to marry my son to his daughter, and that way our royal families will be linked and our nations will be allied. You get the idea, right? And royal children were used as diplomatic tools to further the means of any given nation. And the Habsburgs have become very, very good at marrying into different places to ensure that they have ties to leadership. What happens then when the person in line for the throne isn't necessarily part of that country? You see where I'm coming from here, right? If I marry my son to your daughter and they have children and those children are German, but he's going to be the next king of Spain, we got a problem, don't we? Or maybe we don't. But you don't get to pick the king. And with the Habsburgs, what ended up happening is that these leaders are rulers of places that they never visit. Rulers of places that they have no ethnic tie to whatsoever, but it just so happens that you're the king of this country or whatever. And that's going to certainly be the case with this fella here, Philip II. And we will get into the details, the political aspect of this in just a minute. We rewind the clock here a few times. Philip II is Spanish. He is the king of Spain. He is a member of the Habsburg family. His leadership ability is questionable. Oh well, you don't get to pick the king. Philip is also king of the Netherlands. Philip is also king of the Netherlands. Now, what are the Netherlands? Also known as Holland. The borders get a little wacky, so we're keeping it simple. But in northern Europe, north of France, there is this sort of low-lying, swampy area. Amsterdam is one of the key cities. It's a port city. And the people of the Netherlands, the people of Holland, who we call the Dutch, because none of this can be simple, answer to a Spanish Catholic king because of the way the marriages have worked out over the years. The people of the Netherlands are Protestant. They are not Catholic. They don't like the Catholic Church, never have liked the Catholic Church, and the minute they had a chance to get rid of the Catholic Church, they did. And when your king is a crazy devout Catholic from Spain who has zero tolerance for Protestantism, this is going to be a problem, isn't it? And beginning in the 1560s, leaders in the Netherlands started rebelling against the Spanish crown. A low-level campaign of civil disobedience trying to drive out Spanish leadership. Now, this is complicated. Part of it, of course, is religious. They're a bunch of Catholics, we're a bunch of Protestants, we have no interest in that. It's also political. Why on earth am I answering to a Spanish king? I'm Dutch, I don't have anything to do with Spain, so why is my king from there? Y'all can understand the issue there, right? So it's a little bit of both, and we will get back to this. Rebellions tend to be very expensive. Rebellions tend to be very bloody. They tend to be a real hassle for the mother country. The Netherlands is a pretty prosperous place. These people are good at trading. They're good at making money. Amsterdam and Rotterdam, these Dutch cities are thriving places. Spain makes a lot of money by ruling these places, but at the same time, as the years go by, more and more people of the Netherlands try to drive Spain out, and so it's a mess. Now, if you're Spanish, if you are one of the Spanish people, and all you hear about is this rebellion going on in the Netherlands and all this money and all of this activity, a lot of you might say, hey, you know what, let the Netherlands go, right? We got nothing to do with this. If these people want to be independent, it's certainly none of my business. And so these things can become very, very difficult. By 1600, Spain was struggling financially. By 1600, Spain was struggling financially. For a lot of reasons. The gold was not coming in from North America. The Spanish crown spent like the checkbook was bottomless. And this rebellion in the Netherlands was incredibly expensive and bloody. And finally, in 1609, the Spanish crown relented and the Netherlands became independent. They drove out the Spanish after a good 50 years or so of revolt. They drove out the Spanish after a good 50 years or so of revolt. And this is one of many examples of how a weak people can successfully resist domination from a very strong, powerful nation. You don't have to defeat the big power in order to win. All you have to do is make it so difficult that fighting is no longer worth it. Are we familiar with that in the United States?
Yep.
Vietnam, Afghanistan, etc. Right? I mean, we've become involved in conflicts in recent decades where we were most definitely more powerful, but you can't necessarily win that way alone. And again, all you got to do is look at the Vietnam War to learn that. We lost that war despite winning every single military engagement for the most part that we had. We're going to get back to the Netherlands, but just know they are now independent after 1609. And yes, the borders change because Belgium is involved in this and Belgium becomes an independent country. It's really only the 7 northern provinces, but we don't need to get into that level of detail. They will have a new royal family, the House of Orange. That's what they call themselves, the House of Orange. And they're real proud of the color orange too, just in case you're wondering. Even to this day, the national color of the Netherlands is orange. Anytime you're like watching the Olympics or something, and all the athletes are in this orange stuff, you know you're looking at the Dutch, you know, because the orange is a thing.
They wear orange jumpsuits.
They wear orange jumpsuits, yes, like orange spandex. And their fighter jets have orange on them, just in case you're wondering. Their military planes and stuff are orange. It's kind of weird. Anyway, let's go to England. Everybody in here's heard of England, right? Let's go to England. And we will have to talk about other countries too, because there's interplay involved in all of these movements. Henry VIII is a king I hope you have heard of. He became king in 1509. He became king in 1509. Now, when I say Henry VIII, what are some of the stereotypes that pop up? What do we think of when we think of Henry VIII?
His wives.
Yeah, his wives, and the unfortunate end that 3 of them had. Henry VIII actually executed 2 of his wives. Another one died as a result of childbirth, but executing his wives is certainly what he's known for. He had 6 of them, and he cut the heads off 2. So ladies, you know, your odds are pretty good, I guess. Henry VIII is also sort of lampooned, you know, this overweight buffoon, you know, sort of this man-child that sits around all day eating chicken legs, you know, that kind of logic is a lot of what Henry VIII is associated with. The reality is Henry VIII was not dumb at all. He was a rather intelligent man. He was a very shrewd politician, particularly when it came to foreign policy. And in fact, this idea of sort of this, you know, fat guy on the throne eating all day is really the way he was later in life. As a young man, he was quite healthy, quite athletic, quite dashing. It was, you know, he got older and got lazy, I suppose. But he's a complex character. He was not supposed to be king. He had an older brother who died, and that makes him the eldest son after that point. So in 1509, he becomes king, even though he was not initially supposed to. But that's neither here nor there. In 1509, when he becomes king, England is not the kind of powerful state that we think of today. England was really kind of a third-rate power. England is cold, it's rainy. It doesn't have a large population. It's smaller than nations like France and Spain. It's disconnected from the continent, which today is seen as a tremendous advantage, but at the time was seen as a disadvantage. Henry is determined to elevate England to the status of great European power. England is down here. He wants England to end up here. And like I said, he was actually pretty shrewd and pretty good at making England a stronger nation. Marriages among royalty are always for political reasons. And Henry was married to a woman named Catherine, a Spanish Habsburg princess. She is, in fact, the sister of Philip II. She is, in fact, the sister of Philip II. Now, why is this important? Well, it's because the Habsburgs are a very influential, powerful family in Europe, and allying with the Habsburgs makes a lot of sense in 1509. And it's also worth pointing out, that at this time England is devoutly Catholic, so it's not a conflict there. The Protestant Revolution hasn't really even happened at this point. So what's going to happen here is that Henry and Catherine will have children. Ideally, they'll have a son. The son becomes the next king of England. And they are strong allies with the most powerful family in Europe. Makes a lot of sense. Henry was a member of the Tudor family. Henry was a member of the Tudor family. And although it's not something that really happens, in England it is possible to be the queen in addition to the king. Some countries, only a man can inherit the throne, but that's not the case in England. England can have a queen. If the only child that the king has is a daughter, that daughter can end up being the ruler. That's okay. You get the difference. In France, if the king has only a daughter and he dies, the king's brother becomes the next king. In England, if the king only has a daughter, she's now the leader. Now, it's important to also understand that the spouse of the monarch is not equal. Okay, if the king marries, obviously, the wife might be unofficially called the queen, but she has no political power. You all understand that, right? And if England has a queen, she marries a man, he doesn't become the king. Okay, the husband of the queen is not the king. And he might have a lot of power, but he is not officially that. Well, Henry and Catherine had a daughter. Her name was Mary. Henry and Catherine had a daughter. Her name was Mary. They did not have any more children. Catherine entered her 40s. There are no more children coming. She was actually a few years older than him. So now Mary is going to become queen. Mary is going to become queen. Mary is, of course, every bit a Habsburg as a Tudor, because her mother is, of course, a Habsburg princess. So Mary belongs to two royal families, doesn't she? Mary is a devout Catholic, of course. To a certain extent, Mary sees her Habsburg lineage as more important than her Tudor lineage. None of that really matters, though, because Mary will get married at some point. And what happens if she marries a Habsburg? And yes, that absolutely can happen.
The Spanish control
The
England.
Spanish now rule England, don't they? The Habsburgs now rule England. And knowing that Mary will one day be the queen and get to do whatever the heck she wants, Henry is now deeply concerned because the Tudors aren't going to rule England anymore. His family is now out because you got to have a son to pass on that family line. Well, the Habsburgs know this too, don't they? And the Habsburgs are just rubbing their hands, waiting for Henry to kick the bucket, because now one of them will rule England. And it's pretty obvious that Mary intends to align herself with the Habsburgs. Henry's going to have another child. Henry's going to have another son. Henry's going to have a son. You cannot have children with mistresses and them be considered legitimate. They are illegitimate children and ineligible to take the throne or anything else like that. He has to be married to a woman, and they have to have a child in wedlock in order for that child to have that valid claim to the throne. Catherine's got to go. He's got to get himself a new wife. Now, he's not cutting Catherine's head off. They actually got along very well. They were a very happy couple in every other sense of the word. The only way Henry can get his marriage annulled, or the only way he can get a divorce, is with permission from the Pope, and the Habsburgs were not going to let the Pope do that. You know, the Habsburgs are incredibly wealthy and powerful, and they make it clear to the Pope, you better not do anything to let that marriage with Henry end. So the Pope makes it clear to Henry VIII, no, you will not get a divorce. This woman is your wife, and that's the end of it. And if you don't have any more children, that's God's will. Henry ain't doing it. Henry absolutely insists that he is going to have another wife, and he is going to have a son with that wife. And so in 1534, Henry kicked out the Catholic Church in England. And this was wildly popular with Parliament, with the English people, with the nobility. Everybody was behind Henry on this because they don't want the Habsburgs getting their fingers in England. There is a Protestant Reformation going on. All kinds of nations are becoming Protestant. England joins that fold. Henry creates the Church of England. Henry creates the Church of England. And the crown, the monarch, him, it is the monarch that is the head of the Church of England, not the Pope. The Catholics are kicked out, and a new Protestant church is established so Henry can solve his marriage issue. The Church of England then grants Henry his divorce. He remarries a young woman named Anne Boleyn, an English woman. And Anne Boleyn proceeds to have one child, and that's a daughter. So he didn't get what he wanted. And that daughter will be named Elizabeth. That daughter will be named Elizabeth. He then gets angry at Anne Boleyn, cuts her head off, and his third wife had a son. So he finally got his son. Just took a few wives, you know. Third time's the charm, I suppose. And that wife was named Catherine Howard, but you don't have to get into that. Well, to keep matters simple, Henry's son did become king, but he died as a teenager and is insignificant. Mary did marry a Habsburg. Yes, he was a cousin of hers. And in 1553, Mary becomes queen, which is exactly what Henry did not want to have happen. And the Habsburgs are now firmly in control of England. The Habsburgs are now firmly in control of England. Mary tried to brutally bring back the Catholic Church. This Church of England that her father had created to deliberately kick out the Catholics and the Habsburgs, she completely reversed. Very cruelly, very brutally. Anyone involved in that whole affair was tortured and murdered. That's, of course, why she has her nickname, Bloody Mary. She did not have any children, though. She was infertile. And in 1558, she died probably of cancer.
Why you say probably?
We don't know for sure because of medicine at the time. She developed some sort of problem with her lady business, like her uterus. She had like a tumor or something growing in her. And for a long time, they thought she was pregnant because her stomach was going out like that. But she had it for like 2 years. And it was, we're getting into the weeds here, but she was obsessed with having a child because she understands none of this is going to stick if I don't have children. You know, I have to have a child to carry on this Habsburg rule of England. And so even though it was pretty obvious that she wasn't pregnant, this is some sort of a physical problem, she insisted that she was, and she had to be treated as if she was pregnant. And she was pregnant for like 2 years, okay? And everyone's like, you know, you're not pregnant. There's something else wrong with you. And she wouldn't hear of it. Not that they could have done anything at the time anyway. And then she died. So it was probably like ovarian cancer or uterine cancer or something like that.
Okay, Ms. Smith, let me get this right and make sure I got it right.
Absolutely.
The Catholic Church that you said Harry got rid of, she got it back.
She brought it back because she is a devout Catholic and loyal to her
She
Habsburg.
did basically whatever she had to do to bring it back.
Brutally, yes, exactly. But she didn't have any children.
Okay.
She didn't have any children. Yeah.
You said that he couldn't have any mistresses if they were sons, and
Well,
wouldn't he be divorced and they would be like illegitimate children?
Well, okay. First of all, he had lots of mistresses. Okay, Henry VIII had girlfriends all over the place. And he even had a son from a woman outside of his marriage. Okay, so he had a son, but that was a mistress, not his wife, not Catherine. Okay, even after that divorce, those children were considered illegitimate. And he went to Parliament, and his son, he actually tried to make that boy next in line for the throne. He went to Parliament and said, you know, here's a son of mine, you know, put this kid in line for the throne. Everybody knows this is my son, and Parliament wouldn't go for that, because the minute you start introducing the idea of illegitimate children inheriting the throne, you gum up the works big time, because all of these kings have girlfriends and children. All of these kings are big time players as far as that goes.
But wouldn't like Mary, because she comes, her parents got divorced?
I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying, and because of the divorce, she would be considered illegitimate. You're absolutely right. Parliament was willing to go along with Henry to a certain extent, okay? And see, in England, Parliament makes a lot of these decisions. Parliament declared her legitimate, even though she clearly would be illegitimate if the marriage was annulled. And the problem was Henry's son died as a teenager. See, and so there's really nobody left in the direct family. And so Parliament said, do we go to a foreign relative, or do we go to Mary? And a lot of people in England still said Mary's the legitimate heir. You see what I'm saying? Henry had a sister, just in case you're wondering. Henry did have a sister. She would end up having children, but Parliament was not willing to choose her as queen whenever Henry clearly had this child that had expected to be it. And of course, they're also worried that the Habsburgs might do something like go to war with England if they don't choose Mary. There's another issue with that. You see what I'm saying? So there we have it. So yes, you're absolutely right. Mary would technically be illegitimate. And by the way, Elizabeth was for a while kind of technically illegitimate as well, because he killed her mom. But Parliament declared both of them legitimate children. Parliament ruled that they are
They
legitimate.
were married, but
Yeah.
more illegitimate children come from a girlfriend. They weren't married when they had that child.
Right, but you see, it gets complicated because she's got a point.
She
Henry-
does have a point, that's what I'm saying, but I'm
Yeah.
clarifying that more than likely when they're saying illegitimate, it comes from a girlfriend that were.
Yeah, the concept of an illegitimate child is from a girlfriend, not from a woman that at least one point you were considered married to. But these things get real complicated because you see, Henry didn't actually get a divorce. Henry's marriage was annulled, meaning that according to God, the marriage was never in place to begin with. You see, it's a different technicality. You see, we're really getting into the weeds, but his wife had been married to his brother. Okay, first, Catherine's first husband was Henry's brother. Then Henry's brother died, which made Catherine eligible, and then Henry married Catherine after that. And for lack of a better description, the church concluded that, according to Henry, she was not really eligible to marry him, and we're getting into some complicated legalese. Yeah, I'm confusing you too much. But the short answer is Parliament decided that Mary and Elizabeth were legitimate children, even after all Henry did. Okay, so Mary dies in 1558, no children. England breathes a sigh of relief because this woman was not a good person and they did not want the Habsburgs ruling England, which clearly Mary very openly wanted to see happen. Now Elizabeth, the second daughter from Anne Boleyn, becomes queen. Now Elizabeth becomes queen. She is Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth. To say the least, Elizabeth had daddy issues. Okay, remember, Dad cut Mom's head off. Okay, her mother was Anne Boleyn. And so, her own father had executed her mother. cruelly, by the way, because Anne Boleyn had not done any of the things she was accused of doing. That being said, Elizabeth was able to separate the personal from the professional. Elizabeth was highly intelligent, very ambitious and motivated, and absolutely wanted to continue her father's goal of elevating England to a high status. England is a weak, struggling country. We are going to turn England into a powerful European state. That was her goal. And unlike Mary, Elizabeth was wildly popular, very effective, and she hated with a fiery passion the Catholic Church and the Habsburgs. These are people that were openly trying to rule England. They were trying to strip away England's legitimate rulers, rule as foreigners. That is not going to happen. You know, the poor people in the Netherlands are ruled by this Spanish king, and her logic was, I will be damned if I let that happen here. I will be damned if I allow those bloody Habsburgs to have anything to do with England. Now, she's got a bit of a dilemma there, because she, of course, is a she. And that means if she marries, her children will be members of the family of her husband. Now, she, of course, could marry an Englishman. Nothing wrong with that. She could marry a high-ranking noble Englishman, and an Englishman will still rule England, and an English family will still rule England. But this isn't just about her family. This is about who's the boss. We're living in a man's world, certainly at this time, and the minute she takes a husband, he will, in one way or another, be deferred to as the ruler. You know, we live in a world here, certainly at this time, where women are not respected as leaders once they have, you know, entered into a marriage with a man. And Elizabeth will never have her power questioned. Nobody is ever going to question who is in charge. And so even though Elizabeth certainly had plenty of boyfriends over the years, okay, she was not a single woman in the way she behaved. She was never willing to marry. She was never willing to take a husband. She is the most eligible bachelorette in Europe. She received marriage offers from all over the continent, and of course many high-ranking noble families in England were pointing out the bachelors in their family and reminding her, you know, this is a great English family. There's no reason why they can't, you know, they can't rule too, but she would have none of it. So she remained unmarried for the duration of her life. She wore the royal ring on her wedding finger. And her answer was, I am married to England. I am married to England. For this reason, her nickname is the Virgin Queen. You know, the queen who never took a man. I can assure you, she was no virgin. She had plenty of boyfriends. But certainly that was not something that would have been discussed in polite company, and none of those men were her husband, which meant they don't count. We're going to get back to Elizabeth. Keep her in mind. Quite a girl. The 30 Years' War. Oh, here's Elizabeth again. Apparently she had orangutan arms, right? What's going on with all this? I mean, look at her. I mean, she looks like she's wearing one of those sumo suits, right? I mean, she's obviously a very petite woman. What's all this get up about?
To show power.
Show power, that's right. You know, she has to project size. She has to project authority. She has to project wealth. She has to project wealth. During this era, diamonds were not a thing. Nobody really cared much about diamonds. They don't have any real inherent value. They aren't rare. I don't know if y'all know that or not, but diamonds are certainly not rare by any stretch. They're artificially inflated in value. You have no reason to spend thousands of dollars on a diamond even today, and it wouldn't be until later with the French that diamonds became a thing. What everyone wore to show wealth was pearls, and pearls really are rare, and pearls are hard to come by. Natural pearls are a big deal. You have to go through lots and lots and lots of oysters to find one pearl, and so here she is dripping in them. You know, here she is just drenched in pearls. This is so much money around her neck at the time. You know, your average English family would not see anything close to this kind of money in their entire lifetime if they added up everything everybody made. Many strings of pearls of that length around her neck is a mind-boggling amount of wealth. And so she is having herself painted, showing that. And the idea is to project this image. She has, the crown and all these baubles in her hair, and every one of them has a big old pearl in it. Pearls, 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 pearls. All the pearls all around her, and it would be like diamonds today, just drenched in them. And so this is a multi-million-dollar suit she's wearing here, and the idea is to project power. And by the way, it's always a wig she's wearing. She kept her head shaved and always wore a wig, and the white powder all over her face was just a. What's that?
Because it's my second time taking this, and I remember they used to do something to their face.
Well, remember, we don't have running water at this time. Running water is not a thing. And even though she has access to plenty of water if she wants it, bathing and keeping clean and keeping your hair done, you ladies know what it's like to do your hair every day. It's a heck of a lot easier to just have a selection of wigs that are dewed up the way you want, and you just put the one on your head, and you go about your business. It's a lot quicker and a lot faster. And of course, I'm not sure what the whole white makeup on her face was all about here. She looks like a mime, right?
It's supposed to make you look pale because the poor people worked outside, so they
Right.
There you have it. Okay, that might make sense. All of these, by the way, all of these fashion statements are one way or another to project wealth or project importance. And you're right, poor people work outside and they get tanned and craggly and all of that. And so keeping your face powdered is a way of showing I don't have to go outside. I know that's what long fingernails are about too, just in case y'all are wondering. If you're wondering why, where did the long fingernails become a fashion? It's a way of showing you don't work with your hands. You can't work in the fields if you have fingernails. And so women and later men would grow out big, long, Freddy Krueger fingers to send that image. It's all about projection. And once you quit caring about that stuff, life becomes a lot easier, folks. Okay. One of the rules in life is don't be a chump, okay? And being a chump means spending money on stuff you don't need to spend it on because you're trying to impress people you don't care about anyway.
Trying to keep up with the Jones.
Yeah, don't keep up with the Joneses. That's right. The Joneses are a bunch of jerks. You don't need to keep up with them. I bring that up because we will see the greatest example of somebody who tried to do that here in a little bit. Let's talk about Germany. Okay, now this is critical to keep in mind, folks. Okay, I want you to remember this because this is important moving forward. Okay, Germany is not a single centralized nation. Germany is not a state. Germany is a culture, it is a people. It will be a long time before Germany becomes a country that we would understand it to be, or like France or Spain or England, you get the idea. There are many, and I do mean many, different German states. How about we have a map quiz on this? What do you say? Right?
No.
Now, these people all look German, act German, speak German, they are German. There's dialects and different cultural touchstones depending on what region you're in, but they're all German people. They're all German people in one way or another. But politically, it is an absolute hodgepodge of big, small, medium, all these different royal families, all these different noble families. And the reason why the map would end up looking so wacky gets down to these marriages again. When the noble family marries another noble family, that kid is going to inherit this land over here and that land over there, and it ends up turning into this. It ends up turning into this. And at some point, the German people are going to start deciding that they want to unify into one state. They're saying, we don't want Germany to look like this anymore. But understand, Germany is not unified politically. Lots of different German states. Lots of different German states. We will discuss more of that later. But we need to know is that in North Germany, the Protestant Reformation took off. And the North German people rapidly became anti-Catholic and Protestant. This, of course, spread to the Netherlands. And to some extent, the Dutch are a Germanic people. There's a lot of similarities between the people of the Netherlands and the Germans. The language is similar, the culture is similar, etc. It spread into Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway. They became Protestant. And we're not getting into the North people up there. It's too cold, I don't want to talk about it. England, of course, is in Northern Europe, and the English, as we know, kick out the Catholic Church and become Protestant. Now, if you're the Catholic Church, you're getting nervous, aren't you? All these countries are flipping. Southern Europe tended to remain loyal to the Catholic Church. We have Spain, we have Portugal, obviously Italy. I shouldn't have to tell you that Italy ain't going anywhere as far as the Catholics are concerned. But Germany is the big question, because culturally the North Germans are Protestant, and culturally the South Germans are Catholic. So we have a clear division between the ethnicities, and many, many, many different states, big and small, that are on one side of the line or another. Situations like this are just perfect for a big, nasty war. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. In the first half of the 17th century, roughly, the German states descended into conflict, North versus South, over the religious future of the German people. The Habsburgs in the South, we'll talk about them in a minute, of course, sent army after army to defend the church, and the North Germans sent army after army to fight the church. Other nations would, of course, eventually get involved, and many times this would be for political, not religious reasons. For example, Catholic France supported the North Germans much of the time. If you are an ordinary German peasant, you probably don't care one way or the other. You just hate the idea of conflict going on. If you see either army coming your direction, you're about to have a really bad day. And so the real people that suffered from this were the ordinary Germans, who in one way or another were pressed into this, and they didn't want it. Finally, in 1648, it became obvious that neither side could win. The Catholics cannot drive out the Protestants in North Germany, and the Protestants are not getting rid of the Catholic Church in South Germany. They're going to have to learn to live together. And so the first truly comprehensive peace treaty in Europe, in a modern sense, was signed in 1648, and it is the Peace of Westphalia. It is the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 30 years of really nasty war. Primarily in the German states.
How many years did you say?
30 years. And it's called the 30 Years' War, but really 30 years, I mean, plenty of fighting took place before then, but that's all right. We don't need it. Now, what are the conditions of the Peace of Westphalia? Simply put, the Protestants can be in the north, the Catholics can be in the south, and we don't fight about it. It's exactly what you would expect it to be. We're going to learn to live together and not fight anymore. Of course, that's not the entire treaty. Both, yes?
The Protestants can be in the north and the Catholics in the south.
Yeah, we're just going to live together. We're not going to fight each other about it anymore. Exactly. And that's generally how it worked out. The Protestants were in the north and the Catholics were in the south. The revolution, the Protestant Revolution, had taken place 100 years earlier at this point. But you see, one thing that all of them are worried about, oddly enough, is religious freedom. They're not interested in ordinary people choosing what church they belong to. So the Peace of Westphalia doesn't say you personally can be Catholic, or you personally can be Protestant, or you personally can be nothing. It does not grant religious freedom. The leader of your German state, the German leaders, determine the religion of their subjects. So if you are in North Germany and the leader of your country is Protestant, you are now a Protestant. South Germany, you are a Catholic. So it does not grant religious freedom to the people. It enables the leaders in Germany to determine the faith of their subjects. That's a clear distinction. Now we're kind of getting in the religious freedom direction, right? It's the first step, but understand the distinction. And there are political elements of the Peace of Westphalia too. France at that point had become heavily involved. France got a little territory, some other stuff, but we don't need to get into that. So in 1648, religious conflict in Europe has come to an end. It is now obvious that the Protestants are here to stay. It is obvious that the Catholic Church will still exist. And leaders of countries now decide the faith of their subjects. For the most part, everybody is willing to tolerate this. Now we can talk about the emergence of states politically. Now we can talk about the emergence of states on a political level. And this is when modern states really show up. This is what I would call the emergence of the modern state. Countries that we would recognize in a modern form begin. And this is what Europe would have looked like in 1648. And like I said, we do have to bounce around on the time frame. And I want to begin with France. I want to begin with France. Here it is, here, this big yellow area. France is geographically probably the most well-off state in all of Europe, certainly in Western Europe. France is a good size for a European nation. Small by global standards, but as Europe goes, France is big. France has a lot of good farmland. France has a lot of good farmland. And a climate that is very, very well suited for human habitation. France has a lot of rivers that you can irrigate crops with and build cities on. France has a long coastline on the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. So France can send ships out to the Atlantic, but it can also do trade in the Mediterranean, and it will use that to its advantage, heck, all the way up to the present. You know, France has coastline. Now, again, these are connected, but it puts France in a really advantageous position. Paris is, of course, an incredibly important city. The people of France will consider Paris to be the most important city in Europe. The archetypical European city. The biggest, most cultured, most notable, so on and so forth. And beginning with this era that I'm going to talk about, France emerges as the most powerful nation in Europe, at least for a time. But when you look at France, you can understand, as Europe goes, no nation is better positioned. No nation is better positioned. France, of course, has a king. We've already discussed that. France has had a king for a very, very long time. The people of France are devoutly loyal to their king. We already know that. There is no law, or for that matter, tradition, that defines the power of the king or his role in government. There's never been any kind of real rule regarding what the role of the king is. He's just the boss. That's just kind of the way it is. And so throughout French history, the strength and power of the king has really been based on how big of an army he can field, how much tax he can collect, how much power he can exert over the other influencers in France. And over time, the king has become more and more powerful and more influential. And you say to yourself, well, he's the king. Of course, he's the boss. He's all, that's what the king is. It's really important that you understand that's not necessarily true. Being king doesn't have to mean that you are in charge of everybody. In many, many cases, the king is really more of a symbolic leader with other people in the nation holding the real power. You know, what the actual status of the king is can vary widely across cultures and across timelines and everything else. And the early French kings were actually rather weak. Yes, they got to wear the crown and have all the fancy titles, but they, in fact, personally did not really rule over their countries. You see, France has a lot of very powerful noblemen. France has a lot of very powerful noblemen. And these noblemen have their own armies. These noblemen collect their own taxes. These noblemen issue their own laws and nominally answer to the king, just not for real. And so if the king starts pushing against them, they'll remind him, I've got an army too, pal. So don't push me too hard. And if all the noblemen get together and decide they don't like the king, king's in trouble, right? So the king gaining more and more power over the nobility is a big deal in France. Is a big deal in France. We'll even go down a list very quickly of these noble titles. This gets real complicated in France. But in a simple sense of the word, the man at the very top of the noble food chain is the king, of course, right? Now, who are, you have to write this down, I don't care. Who are beneath a king? If you're not a king, what's the next rank on the noble totem pole?
The Duke.
Well, what's the title?
Princess.
A prince, right? You are a prince, that's the next step down, okay? Now, there's more than one version of a prince, okay? The direct sons of the king are princes of the blood. They are particularly important princes, obviously, because they are the children of the king. But let's say this. Let's say we got the king here, okay? And the king has two sons, all right? So this son over here is the eldest, and he becomes king and has princes. Is the king's brother a prince too?
No.
Well, yes, he is. His dad was the king, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Right? Now, your brother is now the king, but that doesn't mean you're not a prince anymore. It just means you're a prince with the brother as a king. So the king's sons are one flavor of prince. You are another flavor of prince. You get my point, right? Now, of course, in France and in most countries, grandsons of the king are princes too. Okay, it is the sons and grandsons of the king that get to be called prince. Are you following me? And so your brother is the king. Your father was the king, but of course he's dead. Your sons are now princes as well, even though they're just cousins of the real princes and the king is their uncle. You get what I'm saying? So there's different varieties of princes. There's different varieties of princes. In England today, y'all, I hate to get into modern tabloid nonsense, right? But there's the Queen of England, right? And then who's going to be the next king?
Her son.
Her son, and what's his name? That would be Prince Charles. Okay, Prince Charles. And then, of course, he has two sons, William and Harry, right? Y'all are following me? Okay, and Prince William has now married, and he has children, and that's going to be the line, of course, because William is the eldest son, right? Well, Harry is the son of Prince Charles. So Harry is the grandson of the Queen, right? Y'all get that, right? So being the grandson of the Queen, Harry gets to be a prince too, right? Well, Harry married this woman named Meghan Markle. Y'all have heard of Meghan Markle? Y'all have heard about her on the news, right? Meghan Markle apparently doesn't understand how the whole royalty thing works, okay? Like, for example, she was very shocked to learn that she has to bow before the Queen. And it's like, yeah, you bow before the Queen. You know, that's how it works. Everybody bows to the Queen. But they had children. They had children recently. And she got on the news, and apparently she got into a bit of a squabble with the rest of the royals because her children weren't going to be, her son wasn't a prince, right? And she said, hey, it's not fair, you know, my son gets to be a prince. And they pointed out, no, your son doesn't get to be a prince. Your son is the great-grandson of the Queen. Children and male line grandchildren are princes. Y'all get what I'm saying? Great-grandchildren, no. It is William's children that get to be princes. Y'all see where I'm coming from? Harry is a grandson of the Queen, which means his children don't get to be prince and princess. They can have other noble titles, but there's only so much room at the top. Y'all get what I'm saying? And she was like, how come my son doesn't get to be a prince? And they're like, because your husband is not the eldest son.
And she got mad enough and convinced him to denounce her royal.
Yeah, she got all
more
she got
mad
all squabbly.
now that-
Right. It took actually a special decree of Parliament for William's sons to be considered princes too, because see, they're great-grandsons of the Queen, even though they're going to be king someday, right? One of these days they will get that title. Right now they technically aren't supposed to have it, because they're the great-grandsons of the monarch, and great-grandchildren of the monarch don't get to be prince or princess. It's only sons, and until recently it is grandchildren of the sons. Grandchildren of the Queen's daughter don't get to be prince and princess either. It's only grandchildren of the Queen's sons that get to be called prince or princess. But she changed that, so now they all do. These things get complicated. But you have to understand, the people at the top of the food chain have to be a small club. So we have to start excluding people, right? We have to start excluding people. What is below a prince?
Duke.
A duke. A duke. And dukes, very wealthy, very powerful, very influential and important. There's only about a couple of dozen dukes all across France. It is a very rare title. And dukes themselves are exceptionally important. And and some of these European states, some of these German states, are so small that they can't really be called kingdoms. You know, they're too small to be a kingdom. And so they are called duchies. And a duchy is ruled by a duke. A duchy is ruled by a duke. So you could be the ruler of a German state. You're not a king. Your country just ain't big enough for that. You are a duke. You are a duke. And the Austrians will come up with the term archduke, which is between a duke and a prince, because of course they will. These things get complicated. Then below that becomes earls, marquises, etc., etc. And so there's different ranks all along the noble food chain, with, of course, king being the top. Over the course of French history, as I mentioned, the king is gaining more and more power. The state is becoming more and more centralized. The king's army becomes bigger than any of the duke's armies. The royal treasury becomes larger and larger. And since there is no rule as to the power of the king can do whatever he wants with it, right? And boy, they do. We will see the emergence of what we call the age of absolutism. The age of absolutism. An era in Europe where state leaders, kings and dukes, whoever rules your country, hold all power without question. They make the law, they interpret the law, they collect the taxes, they are 100% in charge. And the state that leads the way and demonstrates this more than any other is going to be France. After the Edict of Nantes, France entered into a period of stability and prosperity. France becomes stronger, wealthier, more influential year after year. We talked about our friend Henry IV. He's a pretty good leader, smart guy. France thrived under him, and it didn't stop him from being assassinated. In 1610, somebody blew him up. Now, of course, who becomes the next king? The eldest son of the king. The eldest son of the king. And he had one. And this fella is Louis XIII, who becomes king in 1610. Louis XIII, who becomes king in 1610. Like his father, of course, he was a member of the Bourbon family. I mentioned that. The Bourbons are now the royal family of France. Louis XIII was a perfectly intelligent guy, I suppose. He's not really renowned for it, but he wasn't, incompetent. He sees this power of the king becoming stronger and stronger. The the dukes and nobility in France are getting weaker and weaker, and he thinks this is good, obviously. I like this. France is bringing in more and more money, and I got no problem with that, of course, because he can do whatever he wants with it. Except, he doesn't really rule alone. He doesn't really rule alone. The church, as we've already mentioned, the Catholic Church is a tremendously powerful institution in France. The church is the largest landholder in France. More land is owned by the church than any other institution. There is no nobleman that even comes close to owning the land that the church owns. The church collects a 10% tax on every single French citizen, called the tithe. Church leaders play by their own rules. Church schools educate many, many people in France. Those that can afford to send their children to them, and of course, loyalty to the church is number one on the curriculum. And the church is a very powerful ally of the king and really likes the idea of absolutism, very much likes the idea of the king holding all of the power. A more powerful king means a more powerful church. The king and the church are allies. The king uses his tremendous political power to force everybody to play by the rules. And the number one rule is you are a loyal Christian, or more importantly, a loyal Catholic. And so the church is scratching the king's back by pushing God's will, and the king is your leader, and the king is scratching the church's back by forcing everybody to attend Mass on Sunday. Louis's chief advisor is a fellow named Cardinal Richelieu. He is a cardinal in the church. And cardinals in many ways...
Duke.
Cardinals are often called the princes of the Catholic Church. If the king of the Catholic Church is the Pope, the cardinals sit right beneath him as the nobility. At this time, there's probably no more than about 12 or 15 cardinals total in the Catholic Church. They are immensely wealthy, powerful men. And the leader of the French church is Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu believes that the king should hold all the power. Politically, the king should be absolute. It is God's will that he is the ruler of the French people, and anyone else ruling over them in any capacity is an abomination. When it really gets down to it, Louis XIII didn't do a lot of governing. Cardinal Richelieu ran France. Cardinal Richelieu was the real boss man. He was the puppet master behind the scenes, and Louis just kind of went along with whatever he wanted. Louis just went along with whatever he wanted. Cardinal Richelieu grew the French army substantially, professionalized it, modernized it, and every French soldier is 100% loyal to the king. That includes military officers, what the army does, who the army fights, so on and so forth. You serve at the will of the king. That is the end of it. Cardinal Richelieu organized the courts to answer to the king. Judges and magistrates, people like that, are all appointed by the king and rule by the king's will. You get the idea. Now, who doesn't like this? I mean, the king's obviously cool with it. The church thinks it's awesome because this means more power is being funneled right to the church. These guys are bosom buddies after all. Who's not too thrilled about this arrangement that is clearly happening? How about the nobility? That's exactly right. If you are a nobleman with a long tradition of your own power and your own wealth and your own authority and your own law on your land, you ain't too happy about this at all. Because, of course, what's the point of having nobility if the nobility have no power? What's the point of being a nobleman if there is nothing to back your noble status? If the nobility are nothing more than rich guys that live in fancy castles but have no power behind that. Sooner or later they're obsolete, aren't they? And so the nobility is very, very troubled by the centralization of France and the increasing power of the king. And it's really important to remember that. Being king doesn't mean you have the power. It means you live in a fancy castle and have a crown. You have to get that power and fight for it before people are really going to respect it. Well, Louis XIII dies in 1643. Let's look at his picture real quick. Okay, so what's he wearing? Armor. Now, you'll notice this is pretty fancy armor, isn't it? This is fancy schmancy armor. This is not armor that he's going to wear on a battlefield. French kings are long removed from ever going to... They used to fight in battles all the time, but it's long gone from that era. This is armor that he is wearing symbolically. Why would he wear symbolic armor?
Sure.
He's not going to go to war. He's posing for his fancy royal portrait. Why put on a fancy pair of armor?
Make him look bigger.
To project power. That's exactly right. Notice there's also a sword here, right? I am projecting power. I am telling the French people, I might not be a real soldier. I am certainly the guy in charge of the military. Above all else, you understand, I've got the army. I've got the army. This little medallion thing right there is the emblem of the King of France. Whoever has that medallion is the king. It's kind of like a crown in metal form. And so that's front and center to show you are looking at a picture of the king. You're not just looking at a picture of a fancy nobleman. Of course, the staff here, that is the staff of justice. That indicates that he is in charge of the courts. He is in charge of the courts. You'll see little fleur-de-lis. It's like he's a New Orleans Saints fan. What's that all about? The lily flower. That is what fleur-de-lis means. What's with the lily flower?
It's the symbol of the family.
Bingo. It's the symbol of the Bourbon family. The Bourbons have the lily flower as their family flower, their family symbol. So anytime you see the fleur-de-lis, you know you're looking at a Bourbon. You know, you don't have that if you are not a member of the Bourbon family. If we go back to Henry VIII, I'm sure that knife is there. I'm sure that's accident, right? There's nothing symbolic about Henry VIII. I told you he had a lot of girlfriends, right? Let's look at Philip. Same sort of thing. I'm posing in my fancy armor, holding the staff of justice. And again, I'm sure the position of that staff isn't symbolic of anything else, right? I'm sure he would drive a big truck if he were here today. Louis XIV dies in 1643. The eldest son of the king becomes the next king, right? What happens if the eldest son of the king is a little boy? What happens if he's 5 years old?
He becomes king.
You're stuck with him. He's the king, folks. The king is the king. It doesn't matter how old he is. If he is the eldest son, then he is the king. And that little boy was Louis XIV, who becomes king in 1643. Louis XIV becomes king in 1643. Now, of course, a little boy is not going to politically rule the country. Nobody's going to do that. Everybody knows that would be silly. And so what happens is, when the king is of minor age, there will be a regent. There will be another person who rules in the name of the king until the king is old enough to take over. Until the king is old enough to take over. And big surprise, that regent was another cardinal in the church. Cardinal Richelieu had also died by this point. And so it is another cardinal, Cardinal Mazarin, who was every bit the power-hungry religious leader that Richelieu had been. And Mazarin absolutely expected absolutism to be centered around the power of the king. And that is what he taught Louis. Now, there's one more point that we got to make before we go, and I know we do have to go. The nobility aren't happy with this centralization. They're not happy with the power concentrated in the crown, and we just had a power turnover, and the current king is 5 years old. I see an opportunity. We are about to have a king who could rule for a very long time, and we are tired of having our power stripped away. This is our chance to shape the course of his reign and reestablish power of the nobility and a king that is weaker and shares it. And so the nobility rebel. A rebellion breaks out in an attempt to throw this absolutism trend off track. And this is an event called the Fronde. A rebellion by the nobility against absolutism. A rebellion by the nobility against absolutism. And we will see what effect that has on little Louis on Thursday, because we are out of time. Y'all take care. Have a great day. I will be posting map quiz stuff by the end of the day today. If I don't, somebody email me and remind me.
I will.
You will? Okay.